Great. Thanks so much, Joey. And good morning, everybody. Tom and I are happy to be back at the conference this year, and we're eager to share the survey highlights with you all. So how it's going to work is I'm going to be going over some selected survey data with you, and then Tom is going to be explaining kind of the why behind the numbers. So the first notable finding of the survey relates to banks' net interest margins. Next slide, please. So this year, when bankers were asked about the importance of external risks, net interest margins rose to the top. Closely following and not surprising, bankers selected economic conditions as the second most important risk. Net interest margins was the most important risk that was also identified last year, but economic conditions had replaced loan demand from 2021. So even though economic conditions were identified as a top risk, more than half of the bankers, as Joey had mentioned, saw inflation as being a challenge that, while it persisted, it was one that they felt that they could also weather. So I'm going to turn it to Tom now, who will explain a bit more as to why that is.
Okay, great. Thanks. Next slide. So Meredith provided some play-by-play. I get to do some of the color analysis on this. And so last year when we presented net interest margins was one of the top concerns, and this chart shows kind of why. They've been drifting lower, or I should say the margins have been narrowing over the past several years, but they were squeezed significantly in 2020 and 2021. The reason why it's maybe not the top and concern or as much of a concern, I should say, is that we had a little bit of an uptick here in the margins, and so they're still extremely narrow, but not as narrow as they were in the previous quarters. If you go to the next chart, that shows up in the fact that we're getting a higher average yield on earning assets. So these charts look very similar to each other. They tend to track each other well. So next chart shows kind of why they're concerned about economic conditions and why inflation is such a concern for bankers right now. We're at historic levels of inflation, as the chart on the right shows, in terms of in most bankers' careers. So in about a 40-year time period, the inflation rates haven't been this high, and so there's obvious concern about that. And, this question about, are we in a recession or not? We've had a couple of quarters of negative growth. And so we're certainly at a kind of a stagnating environment that bankers are concerned about, and, concerned about where that's going to go in the future. If you show the next slide, this one is from our quarterly Community Bank Sentiment Index, also known as the CSBS. And I think it really shows that these concerns are justified. That most recent number there of 84 is our second quarter reading, and that's lower than it was in the depths of the pandemic in early 2020. And so that low point just kind of really highlights that concern. And to reiterate what Tom Feit said, the CBSI is now available on Fred, and in about 2 weeks, we're going to release the third quarter results, and all 7 components that make up the index will also be available on Fred for researchers to start to use those and find some good information out of that. So one last plug is for any community bankers that are out there in the audience. Our third quarter survey is open right now until the end of the quarter, which is Thursday. And so if you haven't completed it, please do so. We'd like to have as many responses as possible. And I'll turn it back over to Meredith. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tom. So we could advance the slide. So the next finding that we wanted to highlight from the survey was around competition. So something interesting showed up in competition this year that was different from years past, the level of importance that bankers viewed it as. So as you can see, bankers viewed market competition, so this is pertaining to market competition, as being less important this year than in the previous 3 years when we started asking the question in 2019. This is trending with what we're seeing right now. As many of you may know, bankers are getting a little bit more pessimistic about the near-term outlook for bank mergers and acquisitions. There was another survey that was conducted this month of bankers, and over 80% had said that they expected a deceleration in bank M&A deals over the next 12 months. So we think this can be attributed to overall economic conditions as well as the currently elevated regulatory scrutiny. And again, we'll let Tom add a little bit more color on that.
Yeah, next slide. I showed this information last year that the number of FDIC insured institutions has continued to decline. And so we've had consolidation going on for a long time. In fact, when I started my career at the Dallas Fed about 40 years ago, there were about 15,000 or so financial institutions. So we're at the 1/3 of that level now. And it could be that the reason that fewer bankers identify competition as kind of that most important risk is because they're learning to deal with the competition. But also, I do think if you go to the next slide, it really is because we've got other things that are cropping to the surface here. So the red bars are the most recent results from a question that we ask in our quarterly CBSI. And so if you just kind of put your eyeball on those, you can see that competition is pretty far down the list on what are you most concerned about or what keeps you up at night. Those top risks, again, are inflation, the cost and availability of labor, government regulation, cyber attacks, federal debt deficit. All of those are concerns that are more exogenous in that, it's more difficult for the bankers to be able to control or do things about a lot of those things versus competition, which they hope that they can have a level playing field, fair regulation, fair taxes, and that's where the concerns really on competition come from. So I'll turn it back over to Meredith, and we'll go to the next topic.
Great. So next up for us to discuss how community bankers are thinking about technology. So we have several questions that are focusing on technology this year, even building on what we had in last year's survey. And it's just largely because of the heightened interest and role that it plays in almost every process and practice for bankers now. We wanted to call out two findings, though. First is what is the most significant impediment to adopting new tech, and then servicing customers' crypto needs. So the cost or ability to implement new tech remains the top challenge for bankers. And when it comes to crypto, despite rising popularity, more than 80% of bankers have said it's really not important for community bankers to address. The same applied when we were looking at adopting new tech like machine learning or natural language processing. Tom.
Yeah, next slide. I think community bankers clearly understand the importance of technology to remain competitive and to provide value to their customers. Earlier this year, Meredith and I and John Scott, who's a professor at Temple University and also an adjunct research scholar with CSBS, we did a 7-part blog series that was based on the results of last year's survey, the 2021 national survey. And this blog series is entitled Adapting to the Digital Age. And I encourage you to go out to the CSBS website and find those papers that we wrote on that. But this chart is just one that shows that tech usage is associated with bigger banks. And so some of these things are, I think intuitively obvious. I'm not showing the slides for the other ones, but it was also associated with greater population density and better economies of scale. So we see bankers when they're in markets where they have to really, compete on technology, they're doing it. They're diving in and they have to do it. And I just want to highlight again something that we talked about last year, and that is the pandemic and the lockdowns really showcased the value of community banks for many small businesses in these smaller communities. So they jumped into the technology when they had to, and they got stronger and they expanded their digital presence. And I think they're going to build on that because they have that great relationship lending strategy in order to do so. Back to you, Meredith.
Great. So next slide, please. So related to tech concerns, the next finding that we wanted to highlight is in regards to bankers' thoughts on cybersecurity. So key finding number 4, When it comes to internal risks, cybersecurity remains the most important for community bankers. This holds true from the previous year as well. Tom.
Yeah, next slide is, well, one more slide.
Sorry, yeah,
You want to go back to that one?
sure. Yeah,
Okay.
if we can go back one. Thank you. So this is really related to the previous survey finding on what the most important internal risk was, cybersecurity. It also should come as no surprise then how bankers' concerns around implementing new tech are related to cybersecurity risks. So they are by far the leading challenge for bankers this year in introducing new tech over the next 5 years.
Great. Next slide. I don't have a lot to add on this one. I mean, cyber attacks and cyber crimes are problems in really every industry. But it's super important for our nation's financial services providers because that's, where all the financial transactions are going through. So I think the risk is certainly greater there. Community bankers need to make sure that they have a cybersecurity plan in place, and cyber attacks can certainly be very costly, not just for the bank, but for the economy overall. Meredith?
So our last key finding today pertains to workforce issues. Next slide. So back to the figure on internal risk. This risk only second in importance to cybersecurity is staff retention this year. And lastly, Tom is going to show why that concern is there.
Yeah, next chart. Yeah, thanks. So you'll recall from the chart I had earlier too, we had the labor cost and availability of labor was number 2 in our CBSI special concerns question. And so, the good news here is that payroll employment has finally surpassed where it was in February 2020. But you can see here from the JOLT survey that we still have a lot of job openings. So we have a really tight labor market, a really difficult market for most businesses out there. So it's no surprise really to me that worker retention, cost, availability of labor, those sorts of things are another thing that's keeping bankers up at night in their concerns about how they're going to continue to operate their business. And so I think also just one other point, this is not just an issue for community bankers, it's an issue for many, many industries out there. The most recent NFIB survey, which is the National Federation for Independent Businesses, their small businesses ranked labor quality as the second most important concern behind inflation. So these concerns are consistent across businesses across the nation. Meredith?
Yeah, so last, we just wanted to cover what remained about the same in comparison to last year's survey. So we know that community bankers have not rushed to convert to CECL. Nearly 2/3 of them are planning on deferring their implementation until 2023. As we talked about earlier, despite the crypto buzz and climate risks trending in the news and industry, respondents cited them as not being a large concern for community banks. We know regulation holds as a top external risk that hasn't gone anywhere, but it was a bit less of a risk than it was last year. And then lastly, compliance costs at community banks have continued at levels that have persisted for several years. So we haven't seen much change there. So that concludes Tom and my part of the presentation. So I will turn it back to Joey to wrap things up.